Great. Well, welcome everybody to this 28th PERN cyber seminar on the habitability concept in population environment research. And so I'm delighted to have you here. My name is Alex DeSherman, and I'm one of the co-coordinators of the Population Environment Research Network, along with Susanna Adamo, my co-coordinator, and Lisa Lukang, who is the senior network assistant. We're really glad you're with us today to explore the habitability concept in the field of population environment studies, its relevance, and research implications. We'll be going for the next week with an online seminar about which you'll learn more in a moment. Next, please. So we have a number of co-sponsors for this particular webinar. As always, the NASA Socioeconomic Data and Applications Center, which is managed by Season at the Columbia Climate School, is the core supporter and financial backer of PERN. We also have the International Union for the Scientific Study of Population. We serve as a panel of that IUSSP, and we are also a sustained partner of Future Earth, a major international initiative to study the Earth and human system dynamics. So for this seminar, we're delighted to have two additional sponsors. One is the Habitable Project. We'll be learning more about the Habitable Project in a moment. It's a major European Commission funded project. The second is the Columbia Climate School's Managed Retreat Conference Series, which will be coming up in June next. And all are welcome to attend. There will be a virtual component, and more of that information will be available soon. If you'd like to learn more, we'll be advertising about that on the PERN network. So do subscribe to PERN and become a member free of charge so that you can keep abreast of the latest developments. This conference will be taking place from the 20th through the 23rd of June at Columbia University in New York. You can learn more about it at the bit.ly link at the bottom of this slide. I'll also post that link in the chat in a few minutes. Next, please. So a few reminders for this webinar. Please, if you would, use the chat function and take a moment to write your name and affiliation and also the country from which you're joining us. And if you like, add a sentence about your research interests. If you have questions for any of the panelists, we ask you to not use the chat, but rather use the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screen. And please put reference to the specific speaker or presenter to whom you're addressing your comments so that we can be sure that the right person fields your question. Marian Berderan, a moderator for today's webinar and organizer from the University of Vienna, will be moderating the discussion at the end. The cyber seminar will take place from today until next Monday. You can join using the simple instructions at the bottom. We'll post those as well in the chat so everyone can see. And anyone is welcome to post questions or interact with the panelists on the discussion list. The list is moderated, which means your post will not appear immediately. It may take a couple hours depending on the time difference. It's also worth mentioning that today we will have a time at the very end of the webinar to field your questions, so we're looking forward to that very much. With that, I will say next and pass it over to Harold Sterling.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks a lot. I hope you can hear me. Well, let me briefly introduce to you the Habitable Project. That is the co-sponsor of the PERN Cyber Seminar. Please, next slide. The Habitable Project is currently the largest funded research project on climate change and migration funded by the European Commission's Horizon 2020 program. And it has the broad aim of enhancing our understanding how climate and environment interrelate with social ecological systems and then transform migration and displacement patterns. There are 22 partners in 17 countries involved in this project, which is led by University of Liège and François Gemène, who I don't know, could not make it today, I think. Well, the key objectives are in the fields of exploring the causality. There's a strong modeling component, developing a predictive understanding on the migration environment relations, A large aspect is devoted to adaptation, to support and promote adaptation solutions for populations affected by climate change. One big objective relates to gender and social equity, and this goes towards mainstreaming gender and social equity and intersectional aspects into the climate migration research sphere. And of course, there is a larger policy component with stakeholder engagement aspects. Next, please. The scope is quite broad. There are 5 key or priority countries in Western, Eastern, Southern Africa, and Southeast Asia, plus 2 secondary field sites covering countries of Ghana, Mali, Senegal, and the Western Africa area, Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, and East Africa, South Africa, and Thailand in Southern Africa and Southeast Asia. The project employs a comparative research approach with a variety of methods involved there. And one thing that's probably distinct from lots of other research that has been there before, it's taking the key focus of research on a medium intermediate level between the national or global level and the local place-based case study level, a social ecological systems regional level. It combines methods of qualitative social science, semi-structured interviews, focus group discussions, participatory scenarios, but also quantitative aspects of longitudinal surveys, fuzzy cognitive mapping, and climate migration modeling. Yeah, I think I might talk longer and longer, but I think these are the key features of these large projects. I forgot to mention the website. We post this somewhere, so you can have a deeper insight in different work package and aspects and what the project does. Thanks a lot.
Next slide, please. Yes, thanks, Harald, a lot. And hello from me. So I'm Marion Borderon, a researcher at the University of Vienna in Austria. And maybe I wanted to say a few words about the idea of the seminar before introducing our panelists. So we have had the wish to question the use and relevance of a concept. So in the field of population environment studies, that could bring together current complex environmental and social realities and their possible futures. But we wanted this concept to be free of environmental or social determinism's accusation, if we think about, for example, carrying capacities or sustainability. And we thought that the concept of habitability might be an excellent candidate, and we look forward to your views on this. So particularly thanks to Alex and Susanna and those who keep PERN alive to give us the space for a passionate debate to take place. So I'm very much looking forward to listening our panelists, and also want to thank them for agreeing to offer us insights into the concept, but also into their own work. So we will see from specific case studies, so dryland African cities to the Pacific atolls, to also various definitions of habitability. So we'll also question the normative aspect of the concept, the meanings in terms of migration patterns, the understanding of habitability thresholds, also the use of the concept to study catastrophic climate change scenarios. So I'm convinced that this week promises to be intellectually stimulating, and already this webinar. So we will, I will give the floor to our expert panelist, and maybe Aliu, so from Bayrou University, if you are ready, we are listening.
Thank you very much, Marion. Colleagues, happy to meet you all for this very important seminar. Can we go to the next slide, please? Yes, I think it is quite interesting to share my experiences in doing research, especially that relates to habitability and climate and conflict nexus, especially in dryland areas of northern Nigeria, which exposed, like I said here, where I emphasize, to the dual risks of flooding and droughts. Previously, this area was more of known for its drought incidents, but definitely due to in fact, effects of climate change, we have seen really how flooding has also crept in, compounding the risks and vulnerabilities, especially in urban areas, specifically Kano, Maiduguri, Katsina, and Abuja. Now, of course, if you take Abuja, it's not properly in the dryland areas, but at the same time, Abuja is a recipient of some of the people being displaced by these risks. But now the issue is normally, if you consider a drought and how it expels people from their natural habitats, if you like, this is what was considered as a normality, as something that comes like every other 10 years or something like that. But then the way people frame, the way people understand, the way people define this incident really is still being normalized as the situation was normal. Now, there is no kind of concerted effort by all stakeholders to redefine how people, define, conceive, and perceive, and if you like, as well express the situations at hand as they keep changing. And that is why, based on the experiences that I personally come to realize that the situation at hand at the moment is abnormal. And of course, more and more people are being exposed, but then there is really no clear pathway of understanding the issue at hand properly. And that is why I think I'm trying to propose, or making this proposition on the need to engage with the concept of eco-linguistics to define and express ourselves, both as researchers and stakeholders, this especially the nexus of climate and conflicts. So next slide, please. Yes, just a kind of historical view of what the situation is across the Sahel. I think this is something that is pretty known by most researchers here, and of course beyond this meeting. But looking at the population and how it is being projected to rise to close to 1 billion by the year 2015, we know that definitely these problems will continue to manifest and add into stresses that the Sahel region is known. But then look just at the figures like around June 2010, when some of the highest temperature records were broken, but then more of such records were broken around 2020. So again, if you look at it, look just at the last point there before we move to the next slide, look at the what we have. So next slide, please. So this, we know these are the figures, both by IOM and IDMC, but then is a problem I think that we have, I said it earlier, is about the language or linguistics framing of the situation. locally, the people, you know, the public, the media, the science and social media keep on using the normal situation, but definitely the scenario now needs to be revisited. These are actually based on my experience. So can we move to the next slide? Yes. Now, in northern Nigeria, where Hausa is widely spoken, one could see the way the people define some of these people are displaced. I have Al-Majri here, which is originally from Arabic word, Al-Muhajirun, the migrants, then the displaced persons, the way they are normally in the region, they are understood or perceived as Ngudin Hijra. That's what they are linguistically called. And then, of course, the Abomfua, the Talaka. This definition of these people, whatever we see them, how we see them, definitely we have to change this. It is critical and crucial to change this so that we can engage with reality. Can we go to the last slide, please? Yeah, so yes, we are saying that it is imperative really to make use of eco-linguistics, you know, in situating, reporting, framing, as well as policy engagement. Yes, and of course, this, the use of eco-linguistics will help us really in promoting inclusion in research and bringing out really knowledge, more knowledge-based scenarios for transformative responses, especially for habitability studies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aliou, for your talk. And I hand over to Carol from the University of Melbourne. We are listening. And thanks, Carol, for joining, even so it's late for you.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, it's quite late here. I'm actually just mentioned that I'm now at Griffith University, just left University of Melbourne. But thank you so much for the first talk. I'm really excited to hear the concept of eco-linguistics because it maybe helps me think about my work with a new conceptual framework. So I'll be following up on that very soon, I think. So I'm a cultural geographer, so that kind of linguistic or narrative approach is really important in this area, I think. So my work mostly focuses on atolls, which are low-lying islands. And I have noticed that a dystopian narrative about climate change causing atoll uninhabitability has been repeated over and over again over the last decades. And in the process, it seems that an unscientific leap from risk to apparent certainty has been made in public and policy imaginations. Next slide, please. So on one hand, this narrative of inevitable uninhabitability is superficially, we could say, about saving the victims of climate change, but it is also sometimes a convenient code, I think, for colonialist and racist ideas about whether Indigenous atoll people can or even should remain on their own islands. So I'm really interested in the power of the terms habitability and uninhabitability. And the discourse of inevitable uninhabitability, I think, has taken on a type of truth value that may be far removed from on the ground realities, but perversely can shape those realities. So there are documented very real negative implications of this, such as declining investment by donors in atoll development and in situ adaptation projects. Next slide, please. So Tuvalu is the particular atoll place where I do most of my work. It's a Pacific nation comprised entirely of low-lying atolls. And since 2005, I've been studying how cultural and political identities are constructed in Tuvalu as the ontological as well as material worlds of Tuvaluan people change in a changing climate. And during these 30 years of an uninhabitability narrative, what has not happened in Tuvalu is mass migration, but significant, I think, but rarely noted for its habitability potential is a strong will and desire among government and citizens alike to stay. So political leadership on climate futures in Tuvalu is strong. Members of the National Parliament, such as Nelly Sopoanga, have for many decades even worked on international advocacy for emissions reductions. He has also publicly condemned solutions proposed, such as in Australian think tanks, where there's an idea where Tuvalu might happily swap its exclusive economic zone for Australian citizenship for its citizens, and he's condemned this as colonialist. Also the current Minister for Foreign Affairs in Tuvalu, Simon Coffey, has indigenised Tuvalu foreign policy and is working on reforming international law to ensure that Tuvaluan sovereignty, borders and citizenship are eternally recognised by other states. Extensive land reclamation projects are also underway in Tuvalu, and ordinary citizens continue to strongly reject the idea of being forced to move elsewhere, often using language such as "I will stay here until I die," or that "I would rather be here than a slave elsewhere." So alternative and non-dystopian futures are being imagined and brought into being through the narratives and practices of Tuvaluan people in their everyday life and in their policy. Next slide, please. So the idea of inevitable uninhabitability is not reflected in Tuvalu everyday life or in the policy. Yet very little is known, I think, about how ideas of uninhabitability gain power or how alternatively they are resisted. A social and cultural approach, I think, can be helpful here. People do not just inhabit areas where resources are accessible or where livelihoods are available, but they often live in locations that make sense within a specific history and culture. So habitability, especially for subsistence and Indigenous societies, is intertwined with local knowledge, belief systems, cultural practices and values. And once we understand habitability in this way is situated, questions should be asked about who can and should define uninhabitability of particular places. Next slide, please. I think the inevitable uninhabitability narrative is very problematic here because it glosses over opportunities to spend time and energy defining what habitability means in detail. More useful are attempts to define habitability within science, but these have not to date put atoll people at the centre as experts. Western science, however helpful in identifying the material effects of, for example, sea level rise on atolls, is limited, I think, in the extent to which it can grapple with the meanings and experiences of habitability within the culturally specific worldviews of the people who live there. And I'm saying this as more than what's needed is more than a co-production of knowledge of habitability. I think atoll people are the experts in their own habitability, and this expertise has not yet been recognised nor made visible. But there is a role for the international community to help build, without dominating, some more culturally respectful and ethical spaces for atoll populations to debate and define the central concepts of habitability and uninhabitability as they apply to them. Science can contribute where invited, but not in a way that dominates what habitability will end up meaning for atoll people. Donors, I think, similarly have a role. They can and should contribute to improving habitability where climate impacts warrant this, but only on terms approved by atoll people. So, for example, current land reclamation projects are potentially undermining local ecologies, and I think most atoll people would insist that the raw materials should come from elsewhere rather than from their own local environments. So, to conclude, I think atoll people should be at the forefront of imagining and building their own futures, and so the power to define the habitability of their place should be in their hands.
Oh, thank you, Carol. And next slide, please, where we will now invite David Wrathall from Oregon State University. The floor is yours, David.
Thank you very much, Marion, and thanks to the other panelists and presenters, the organizers. I'm an associate professor at Oregon State University. where I've been running the Habitability Lab since 2016. I'm presenting on behalf of an author team that's been working on this issue, comprised of Alex DeSherbinen, Michael Oppenheimer, Radley Horton, and others. And I'm delighted to be here. This is such an important topic, and I'm so excited to be with these panelists who have so much to say on this. Next slide. So what you're looking at here, just to put our feet on the ground in places where habitability is a real concern, you're looking at a parade for the annual feria in Santa Rosa de Aguan in Honduras. Santa Rosa de Aguan until the late 1990s was the center of the Garifuna people in northern Honduras, which has settled coastal communities between Honduras and Guatemala and Belize. About 400,000 people living on this coastline. So this was the Santa Rosa de Aguan was the capital of the Garifuna people. So what you're looking at is the center of the community. This entire group of people. It was a beautiful place by all reports in the 1990s. These arrows that you're looking at point to a health clinic and the main market in town. So if and a series of tropical cyclones hit this area, affecting devastating different parts of the economy and society in the late 1990s and the early 2000s. If you'll advance to the next image, we can see what it looked like in 2009, just 10 years later. The same health clinic, the same market. So this destroyed the physical infrastructure, supporting the economy, governance, cultural reproduction, the necessary ingredients for sustainable development. So after this first storms, people began to, a series of storms, people began to move away. The movement away destroyed this very robust fishing industry, which collapsed in the years following. So if you'll advance to the next, you'll see the next image, the state of things just last year. So if we were to examine this photo in this town, we'd see three simultaneous threats that emerge to the people living in this place. If you'll just advance, threats to physical and psychological safety, threats to livelihoods in a local economy, and threats to this community's capacity to collectively manage risk together. Okay, so to the next slide, please. What you're looking at is a figure that's meant to represent a particular community in a habitable state. So this community is that black dot in the upper left, high habitability, low climate risk. And as this community experiences threats of increasing gravity, it can shift towards an uninhabitable state to the lower right, low habitability, high climate risk. Next. As the community experiences losses, there will be signals of this shift happening. So for example, as it loses capacity to collectively manage risk to, say, agriculture, we might see food insecurity. Next. As livelihoods become collectively threatened, such as the example of Santa Rosa de Aguan, where the fishing industry collapsed, we might see migration. Next. And as the basic conditions for physical and psychological safety deteriorate, we might see mortality. And these would all be signals, important signals of a shift that's occurring in this place's habitability. Next. So this transition from high habitability to low habitability occurs as communities encounter barriers to adaptation, or soft adaptation limits, as we refer to them in the IPCC. These are things that stand in the way of adaptation: the lack of resources, the lack of institutions, the lack of organization. Next. And this also, it's a combination of soft adaptation limits and hard limits, the immutable constraints on our ability to get along in a specific place, like the fact that humans cannot live in land that has been submerged very well. Next. So apologies, please listen to my voice and don't focus too much on an equation. I know it's early for some people or late, and I don't want to lose you. But if we are to assess habitability at scales beyond a local scale, we need a formal definition for habitability. So just bear with me here. H equals habitability, which is the sum of individual perceptions or individual determinations about habitability that all people in a given setting N would make together. H is the sum of individual determinations averaged. And so habitability depends on two terms. It's this in the brackets there. You see these two terms, one term, comma, second term. The first term is the sensitivity of people's physical and psychological safety to climate hazards, multiplied by their exposure to climate hazards. So this is the sense of the risk component of this problem. Next. So a person, this next part is the person's, on the top of that, of the fraction, is the person's capacity to adapt in order to obtain a specific goal. So we have two goals here, safety on the one side, and then livelihoods on the other. This is key, adaptive capacity. The more adaptive capacity a person will have, or a community to collectively, the greater they will deem this place to be habitable. So the second term is essentially the same. We've got physical safety, physical, psychological safety on one side, and then livelihoods on the other. If you can't earn a living in a place, then it becomes very difficult to live there. Next. So traditionally, the habitability assessments that we've seen have looked at the risk component, this bottom part of the fraction, exposure times sensitivity. So this is a map that's from a paper that was led by Radley Horton, showing two different types of sensitivity. Wet bulb temperature threshold for human health. This is the idea there's a specific threshold beyond which the human body doesn't do very well. So this is, you'll see this from the tan to the black, where the black areas on the map represent places that will exceed 50 days of the year where it's too hot for the human body to be comfortable. This represents the sensitivity of the body and areas of likely exposure. So we also see extreme sea levels. The blue and green dots are places that'll be inundated. The dark blue dots are places that will on average be inundated every single month. So again, this is how we've approached the issue of habitability assessment in the past. And the idea here is this is not sufficient, that we need to, looking forward, we need to address adaptive capacity. And I could spend another 20 minutes talking about adaptive capacity. The idea is that it should be local, that there's a rate of adaptation that needs to happen in order to keep up with changes. And that there's this intersubjectivity problem, that our notion of being adapted is related to everyone else's notion. Okay, so on to the next slide. So this is just to say that, please, actually, let's skip through this one too. Next, and the following. Where are we? There, okay. So if we take these two terms and we think about them on two different axes, then we have, we can map these out for any individual. This is the safety component against the livelihood component. So for any individual, we can map these out to determine a specific threshold. Safety on the left, livelihoods on the right. Next. And we can sum up all of these for a community. This is one person's individual location. Next, if you go to the next slide, then we can sum these for an entire community, N, and come up with a threshold for the community, as well as a minimum and a maximum threshold for these. And I guess there's some text that's not showing up there. I apologize for that. But the aim is to operate in the green space where everyone comes to a determination that a place is habitable. And the basic argument of my talk here should be, what I'd like you to take away is that given enough adaptive capacity, everywhere on Earth can be habitable. And I'll just leave it there. Sorry.
Thank you very much, David. So maybe just quickly to recap where we are, because some people might join the way. So we have had 3 presentations. That was David to help define habitability. We had Carol and presenting the Pacific atolls and resisting habitability. Ali Ubaro presented the eco-linguistic of habitability. And now I will invite Luc Kemp from Cambridge University, and Luc will talk about habitable futures. The floor is yours, Luc.
Thank you, Marion. So today I want to talk about uninhabitability in relationship to the subfield of global catastrophic risk and existential risk. Next slide, please. So a lot of this is going to be drawing upon a paper that I published in co-authored with a number of others, including Jan Rockström, Tim Lenton, and several others, called Climate Endgame last August. In this, we try to talk about why and how we can explore the worst case scenarios and the extreme risks of climate change. And one of the things we do here is we try to put forward a vocabulary and lexicon for talking about extreme risks in climate. And we tend to actually avoid the term existential risk. So existential risk as a term of art in the field tends to be quite ambiguous, and I've in the past been very critical. Most people, when they talk about existential risk, use it as a way of referring to a loss of human potential or human value going into the future. I personally dislike that. I think it's incredibly subjective and ambiguous, and usually prefer to talk about more things like global catastrophic threat. So this is the likelihood of losing a quarter of global population and having a severe disruption to global critical systems such as the food system within a given time frame. Now, one key thing to mention here, which I think people often get wrong, is when we're talking about catastrophic risk, extinction risk, you're really not asking the question of, is this particular event or process a catastrophic risk? You're really asking, what's its contribution to the overall level of risk? And I think that's key, because often people do ask this question of, is climate change an existential threat, or is climate change a global catastrophic risk? And the key thing here is it depends upon the scenario. A world with 3 degrees of warming, which is also a world marked by polarization, high levels of inequality, poor adaptive governance and technology, is probably going to fare very poorly. By comparison, a world with 3 degrees, which is also marked by equality, high levels of multilateral cooperation, good adaptive technology and governance, and equality, is probably going to fare quite well potentially. So a lot of this does depend upon these soft adaptability areas. Next slide, please. And when I think about climate change and uninhabitability and risk, I think one thing that we tend to do is we tend to get stuck upon very particular aspects. So I'll just quickly click through. There's a couple of ones here. So one is anthropogenic emissions. The second is Earth system responses. The third is climate change impacts. The fourth is societal fragility. Basically, how do we respond to it? How do we respond, and potentially how vulnerable are we to impacts? And the fifth is human responses. So generally speaking, when people think about uninhabitability and also when they think about extreme risks, we tend to get caught on climate change impacts as well as proceeding through. So there's always these big discussions of, are we on RCP 8.5 emissions? How bad will the impact be? And I think we're not focusing enough upon societal fragility and how do human societies respond. Next slide, please. Now, in the paper, we don't actually talk much at all about uninhabitability. The closest we ever get to discussing this is in one area we try and map out parts of the world which are likely to face what we call extreme heat areas, which is basically areas with a mean annual temperature of above 29 degrees Celsius. This was used as a rough proxy for areas which currently don't have a subsistence strategy, or people don't have a subsistence strategy of industrial food production. So there's only roughly, I think, 20 million people in the world right now who live in areas of 29 degrees mean annual temperature, and they tend not to rely upon industrial food production, but rather things like pastoralism. But once again, that's not necessarily uninhabitability. It's the closest we do get that. Next slide, please. And in the paper, we do talk about this research agenda for exploring extreme risk scenarios. And the first is looking at extreme Earth system states. So how does the Earth look like in the very long term? So click through, please. I'll just go to the next slide if possible. Yeah, exploring Earth system states, modeling mass mortality and morbidity. The third is looking at societal fragility, and the fourth is bringing it all together in the creative climate catastrophe assessments. Now, when thinking about uninhabitability, probably the most relevant ones here are both exploring extreme Earth system states, and not just thinking about lethal heat stress, but kind of all the planetary boundaries, and looking at societal fragility. Next slide, please. Now, thus far, when it comes to the field of existential risk, when people have spoken about existential risk and climate change, they tend to hinge upon a fairly naive and simplistic reading of uninhabitability. So the two key texts here are both public-facing ones. One is the book of The Precipice from Toby Ord. It's an academic at the University of Oxford. He essentially gives climate change an existential risk probability of 1 in 1,000 for the century. And his analysis is essentially one of just looking at the different impacts of climate change and trying to tally up as to whether they would make the entire world uninhabitable. In short, would we potentially reach scenarios where the entire world is covered by areas of extreme lethal heat stress, so exceeding that wet bulb temperature? And he concludes, no, that there's no scenario that really occurs. Even places like New Zealand are always going to be habitable. So he's not really asking, is it an existential risk, but is it going to make the entire world uninhabitable? And Will MacAskill, in his book, What We Are the Future, the bestseller from last year, does a very similar approach, where rather than really trying to explore, is an existential threat or is it a global catastrophe risk, he basically asks, will climate change make industrial food production impossible? And concludes, no, even under the worst case scenarios, there's still going to be areas of the world where you're not passing lethal limits for crop growth, and hence we should be fine. Next slide, please. And the other big books in this area, such as Uninhabitable Earth and Our Final Warning, interestingly, despite being called the Uninhabitable Earth, don't really go into whether the entire planet will go habitable. For what it's worth, the IPCC in 2009 did note that a runaway greenhouse effect seems vanishingly unlikely and implausible, although there has been some recent papers on things like a moist greenhouse effect, which suggests that it could potentially be plausible, but more research is needed. Next slide, please. But the big problem, of course, across all of this is that whether something is catastrophic or an extreme risk, and of course for who, is not simply dependent upon these hard adaptation thresholds. And I think it's simplistic and naive to simply look at things like extreme heat stress, wet bulb temperature, and whether crops can still grow. We need to take a much more expansive view, as I was pointing towards things like soft adaptation limits. And additionally, we have to start thinking about risks and impacts beyond climate change. And this is one of the key things we try to push forward in the Climate Endgame, is that when we think about climate, we have to also think about its relationship to a number of other risks, whether it's things like state failure, inequality, conflict, etc. And of course, all of those are also going to change whether certain areas are uninhabitable. Thanks for your time.
Thank you very much, Lou. And we'll invite our next speaker, David Auburn from Lund University. David, you are muted.
Sorry. So hello, everyone, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me. I've enjoyed listening to the other presentations, and I look forward to interesting exchange over the coming week, and I think it seems like there will be a lot to discuss. So my goal with today's presentation and the accompanying short paper is to contribute to the conceptual discussion around the definition of habitability as an emerging scientific concept, and one that can hopefully overcome environmental determinism, bring together natural and social dimensions, and so on. But I focus today only on its normative dimension, so I'm not attempting a complete definition of habitability. And even though I do kind of propose a particular approach into this, I think the most important suggestion that I have is that we are conscious and explicit about this normative content of the concept as we continue to discuss and define it. So next slide, please. So as habitability emerges as a scientific concept, I think we should be careful not to let it get defined implicitly, which I think there is maybe a danger of. There's a tendency, I think, with much of the attention to the concept of habitability coming from migration and mobility studies, to imply an inverse relationship between habitability and migration. It's expressed in the kind of general concern that decreasing habitability will lead to increased, even mass migration. But without denying the real danger that climate change poses and the possibility of huge changes in global population distribution, I think we should be careful to still develop a precise definition of habitability. You know, perhaps it's obvious to say, but habitability is more than simply what causes people not to migrate. And before we even have a kind of full and complete definition of habitability, we know that there are some apparent contradictions to that implied, inverse relationship. Historically, we know that improving quality of life in particular regions actually leads to increased migration. And conversely, we know that there are many people who choose to stay even when they know that habitability, according to any measure that we might develop, is going to massively decrease due to, for example, an extreme event. Next slide, please. But still, I think it's important to have a definition of habitability that is somehow related to migration, but not to oversimplify that relationship. So I start from one important difference that I see between these two concepts, and that's their normative status. Migration and mobility, we generally use descriptively. They describe certain kinds of action without claiming that it's either good or bad. But it's very difficult to think of habitability in the same way, as we see with many of the presentations so far. Surely habitability is something that we want to protect, maintain, and even improve. Descriptive accounts might be possible, but it's not exactly, obvious that they're in any way useful. And anyway, when it comes to practical action or policy proposals, we can't avoid being normative. So I think if this is the case, then a clear, consistent, and coherent account of its normative content is necessary for the concept to be scientifically useful. And in this, I follow a lot of philosophers of science who argue that, normativity in science is acceptable, but we need to be conscious and attentive to it because consistency in thought is a requirement for consistency in action. So then to the normative content of habitability. And just because, as I said, mobility doesn't itself have normative content, this hasn't prevented normative investigation of different types of mobility. So from this, we have concepts. Sorry, I think, yeah, no, that's fine. I thought we needed to change slide, we don't. So from these discussions, we have concepts, normative concepts like forced displacement and involuntary immobility or trapped populations. And I think these provide a good key to what habitability should mean normatively speaking. They point to choices or questions of choice or volition and conversely to force. So now just in relation to mobility, I think a conceptualization of habitability should include the minimization of involuntary immobility and of forced displacement. So it seems like freedom, the freedom to choose to migrate or to stay, should be a kind of central component of how we see habitability. But in order for this to be scientifically and practically useful, we need a more operational definition of freedom. And furthermore, when it comes to actually doing practical action or policy, it's important to relate alleviation of these mobility-related unfreedoms to alleviation of other unfreedoms that might exist in a particular region. Next slide, please. So for such a definition, I turn to Amartya Sen's concept of freedom as capability. So capabilities are understood as substantive freedoms, the conditions that contribute to people's ability to live a life we have reason to value. So following this, we could think of habitability as the capability set available to people in particular places. So this can mean the basic components of a free life, like food and shelter, that are available to people in particular places, but also to more complex and social ones, like education, connection to community, access to meaningful work, and so on. But whereas some proponents of a capability approach propose a universal list of capabilities, this is Martha Nussbaum's approach, Sen focuses on the idea of social choice. Well, this is an ideal where the capabilities that are prioritized in public decision-making, or in this case, in defining the habitability of a region, are decided on by all affected parties using strict participatory procedures, mathematical techniques to aggregate the diverse priorities that might exist in that region. So I think Sen's social choice approach to capability is important because what emerges from these procedures in defining habitability is context-specific, it's socially defined, and it allows the expression of subjective priorities, but at the same time subjects these subjective priorities to public discussion and validation. I think there are some other benefits to the capability approach that it's important to point out. I think it gives a reasonable account of people's motivations. So what actually motivates people to stay or move, much better than purely biophysical definitions of habitability. At the same time, it's relevant to policy and decision-making, unlike purely subjective ideas of what habitability might be, which are difficult to operationalize. And finally, as a guide to public policy, it includes far more factors than income, which is, a dominant indicator in much public decision making, if it's not in science. But at the same time, capabilities are aggregable and can guide decision making in a way that other multi-factor or dashboard of indicator type approaches often struggle to do. But of course, then with such an involved and participatory approach to defining habitability or to doing policy making, it requires certain institutions and political support for doing it, which brings us on to the last point. Let's change slide, please. And that is that pursuing such a normative approach implies political implications. If we accept that a certain course of action, a certain way of defining habitability is desirable, then we need to look in society where the will to try and put such a procedure in place exists. And this can mean looking beyond the state. And then next slide, please, finally, to summarize, just some points to summarize. But I'll leave it there because I'm out of time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for your presentation. We have 2 more left, and so we will welcome Harald Stereli from the University of Vienna, who will talk about inequality and connectivity. Harald, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks to the organizers, also to all the panelists. This has been up to now a very, very thriving and inspiring session. Well, I want to highlight here 2 aspects that, from my view, are necessary to a productive understanding of habitability. First, changes in habitability are not affecting all people all the way and the same way. And second, it's important to consider connectivities and teleconnectivities to better understand habitability. Next slide, please. First, habitability is socially and intersectionally differentiated. Habitability is not the same for everyone, obviously. It is unequally distributed along multiple and intersecting axes and dimensions of difference, such as gender, age, ethnicity, class, caste, etc. Very much like we think nowadays, risk, exposure, or vulnerability. Why is that so? First, changes in habitability are not affecting all the people in the same way, but rather depend on the ways how people interact with place. A dryland savanna, for example, might be perfectly habitable for pastoralists with their extensive use of land, water, and resources, while it might be literally uninhabitable for rice farmers with their much higher demand in terms of water. And second, changes in habitability do not affect all the people to the same degree. Rather, this depends on social status and resource endowments of individuals and groups. For example, a given place might be habitable for people who are well off, while poorer people might perceive it as much less inhabitable. For example, when internal redistribution mechanisms fail due to resource constraints or pressure, or when certain ethnic or social groups become excluded from resource use due to scarcity. Next slide, please. Well, and then habitability is strongly shaped by teleconnections and translocal relations and exchanges. Places never existed, never probably have existed in isolation. Therefore, it is necessary to consider them as linked and their internal dynamics and processes and resilience as the outcomes of internal processes and the combination of external processes and linkages. Places are connected to other places, but also entities on higher levels, such as central governments, through at least 3 ways: biophysical systems and exchanges, material and immaterial structures, and then flows of resources, people, and information. Examples for these are all sorts of water, nutrient, biological cycles, but also transport and communication infrastructure, symbolic, political, or administrative relations, or financial and goods transfers, interactions, or migration. And all of these do influence habitability of places. Consider the important role, for example, of agricultural subsidies and policy measures in the European Union to sustain livability of depopulating rural areas, or the importance of food aid provided to poor people in the Horn of Africa explicitly to prevent further drought displacement, or generally the remittances sent by migrants all over the world. Governments and private corporations are especially important actors for increasing or maintaining, but also for decreasing the habitability of certain places. When funding and supporting irrigation infrastructure in desert areas, military towns in high mountain areas, or mining places in the Arctic or in deserts, they create or sustain habitability of otherwise non-habitable places. They do this with certain intents, for example, for asserting territorial control, for securing boundaries or access to resources. They can also, and Carol already highlighted that, they can also seek to maintain existing infrastructure and thereby decreasing habitability of places. And finally, they also have the power to define structural, market, policy, and other frameworks that set the stage for exchange and interaction relations. Thus, connectivity can increase habitability, but also can decrease it, or both can happen, first one, then the other. And it can, in addition to stabilizing social ecological systems, also increase their vulnerability if they are very dependent on it. Think all back in how seriously the global supply chains and different places and regions were affected through the COVID outbreaks in 2020 and 21. So next slide, please. To incorporate these thoughts, it is, in my view, very helpful, similar to understand habitability, similar to affordances, as neither resulting alone from the inherent properties of places, nor from cultural or social construction and perceptions of places, but rather as an emerging property that results from the interaction of these two. So how people and places interact. The way how habitability and habitability changes are experienced by a certain group of people is shaped through the way that they have in the past and have been able to engage with their natural and built environment. As such, habitability is both an outcome as well as a precondition and the condition for shaping and changing place usage, place experiencing, and the perception of place. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Harald. And move on to our next and last presenter. So Maria Gavonel from the University of York will talk about thresholds and migration.
Thanks, Marion. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to discuss briefly the relationship between habitability and tipping points in climate migration today. Next slide, please. So I'll start with two working definitions that I'm going to refer to throughout the presentation, starting with that of social tipping points. So these are also known as tipping points in climate migration, or a point in a social ecological system at which a very small change in climate variability can trigger a nonlinear change in outmigration rates. And by nonlinear, I mean basically a discontinuous change that can go either upwards or downwards. So it can be an increase or a decrease in outmigration rates. And I will explain a little bit in more detail this in a little while. Next slide, please. So the second working definition is that of habitability. And we define it as the capacity of a social ecological system to sustain the lives and livelihoods of the human population that forms part of it. Here, we just want to highlight two things. The first one is that we want to emphasize the interaction among the specific elements of the SES, both the physical elements, but also the social elements. As it has been mentioned before, it's actually the specific interaction of these two elements that can result in a particular given capacity of the system to be resilient. And the second aspect that I would like to highlight is that lives and livelihoods can be both threatened directly or indirectly. Directly, if, for example, lives are threatened by, let's say, an extreme event, or indirectly in the case where livelihoods are threatened through, for example, food insecurity, as has already been mentioned in a previous presentation. Next slide, please. So habitability is proposed here under the light of it can be understood as a latent variable. That means that it's a concept that cannot be directly observed, but that can be inferred through the observation of other variables. In this case, these other variables would be either the intensity of in situ adaptation or out-migration rates. And I will explain now what I mean by this. So the idea is that habitability runs throughout a continuum that cannot be observed, but we can observe the consequences of habitability or uninhabitability. So when starting from the top of the inverted triangle, when the SES is at the habitable level, there is not much reliance on adaptation measures. So just to say that even in these cases, some adaptation in situ and some migration would be observed, but people can live and thrive without relying too much on these mechanisms. So this is just to highlight that migration in itself is not a tipping point. It's when we observe an abrupt change in migration rates that we define a tipping point. So just the fact that a person or a household moves doesn't mean that they are necessarily going crossing a threshold. So this is when the SES becomes less habitable, the SES crosses its first threshold, and there is an increase in the demand for in situ adaptation, and therefore we observe an abrupt or a discontinuous increase in the intensity of in situ adaptation. We define intensity of in situ adaptation as basically the number of adaptation measures carried out or implemented by a household or an individual. Then, as the SES becomes uninhabitable and it crosses its second threshold, then the costs of in situ adaptation become greater than its benefits. So migration becomes basically the only alternative. And we observe an abrupt change in out-migration rates, which reflect, for example, an increase in both voluntary and involuntary migration, which also relates to what has been mentioned in previous presentations, that involuntary migration can be a sign of a threshold, of crossing a tipping point. So here, just to summarize, the relationship between population levels and habitability are directly proportional. So it's posited that basically the more habitable an SES, the higher the levels of population in that community or locality. Next slide, please. So here, just to say, so I'll briefly summarize that the drivers of habitability, or how we conceive are the determinants of habitability, are the interplay of three elements. Risk, defined not only as the physical aspect in terms of hazard and exposure, but also the social aspect, which encompasses the vulnerability of the populations inhabiting a particular place. So it's the interaction of these three things that constitute risk as defined here. Then climate change increases the level of risk, which in turn increases the demand for adaptation responses. If effective, these adaptation responses, then risk can be reduced. But if maladaptation takes place, then it can even be increased or exacerbated. And finally, the third element is place attachment, which is what Harald has highlighted, is the relationship between people and places, and how these depend, for example, in the level of social capital, defined as the amount of networks that people can have that can bring benefits in times of need. So it's the interaction of these three elements, risk, adaptation, and place attachment, which can determine the level of habitability of a place. And I'll just stop there, but I'm happy to discuss further in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. Thank you very much to all for all the very interesting, exciting presentations. So we can open the Q&A sessions that I'm happy to moderate. And so we have a few questions. And maybe as a starting point, I just wanted to, okay, sorry. Yes, so maybe just a very specific question first, which I think would be addressed to David Auburn, where it was shared during his presentation. So whom would you say are the most crucial players in the normative habitability process? Civil society or political players? And the user is anonymous, so
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I guess the short answer would be that it depends on the particular context that you're talking about. And as a researcher, I think would be, you know, our duty to try and determine through analysis who the most likely agent of social change could be in a particular situation, who is going to push for you know, a capabilities approach in whatever decision making we're talking about. So throughout history, we know that social movements have been very important for expanding the freedoms of particular groups, but we also know at other times governments with very high state capacity and a willingness to redistribute resources have been very important for expanding the freedoms of particular groups. So I think it could, depending on the context, be either one. But at this historical moment, when redistributive policies and politics are less and less on the agenda of many governments, I think we should be looking more to the role of civil society and social movements in pushing for these kind of decision-making approaches to be put in place. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, thank you very much, David. So we have two other points that's a little bit broader. One question from Adelowo Adewin, who asked, what does climate change has on habitability? So what does climate change have? So I guess it's quite broad.
I could venture a guess here. The idea is that with climate change, not all hazards are equal when it comes to habitability. So I can just reflect this from the IPCC experience. I was a lead author on the 6th assessment, and we did a systematic review of the impact of all of the different climate hazards, 22 different hazards on livelihoods, just to this is an important dimension of habitability. And it really was kind of a collection of heat and drought and coastal inundation that become very problematic for livelihoods. And so there are other climate hazards that are very important, that are driving other types of change in our world. But where habitability is concerned, I might venture to say that the combination of heat and drought on one hand and coastal inundation on another are pretty unique and should be considered.
Thank you very much, David. So we can jump in another question, so which also could be linked. We were now just mentioning climate change, an aspect, and we have a question saying that it seems that the whole debate of habitability looks like human-centric. But so what the panelists think? What do you think about the role of nature, biodiversity, ecosystems in the whole concept? I guess maybe on this, for me, it's a point I also had in mind, the idea that how, for example, so we had mentioned So like, for example, temperature, heat waves, this aspect, but a bit less through the biodiversity consequences. And if, for example, the collapse of the biodiversity, or what would it mean for habitability? Do you have something in mind on this, Aliou?
Yeah, in my opinion, whether it is urban poor or people being displaced from stressed areas, my experience has shown that, for instance, in situations whereby farmers, being forced to leave their habitats, wherever they arrive at their destinations where they feel safe, they still try to reflect on some of the livelihoods that they used to do in their places of origin. Now, let me give you an example of the situation in Kano, where some of the migrant Tuaregs that end up in Kano City, who cross border from Niger Republic, they still try, to raise some animals, because this is what they used to do, before drought. So they try to do that. At the same time, some people displaced maybe by flooding, or failure of rainfall, they still try to engage in some activities such as urban farming. And I think that is where, the aspect of the connection between displacement, climate change, and the people, and the biodiversity and the displaced person in this context, for instance, comes to play out. And we find this especially as well in places like Ghana. We also see this element where people try to engage with some activities on marginal agricultural landscapes. So I think that is a connection, but it may not be definitely an effective way of maybe promoting or conservation of biodiversity, so to say. But at least that is that element or symbolism that people try to attach with what they do in their local environment. And there's something with what I saw through interaction with some respondents who are creating a safer space project in Maiduguri in northern Nigeria. Some of the victims of Boko Haram crisis also try to replicate some of these livelihood options in urban areas. Of course, that creates a kind of crisis with communities, because they feel, why are you bringing this kind of thing into our midst? But I think that these survivors always try to reconnect, to their landscapes, a kind of small teleconnections with their environment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aliou. Want to also to say because we have quite a lot of questions coming, so that's really great to see that it generates a big debate. Just also to say that we will have the week and the opportunity of each day to discuss and to exchange. To go through the writing part of the debate. There were a few points that could wrap up together about so some of our so if the audience are interested in understanding a little bit more about the concept of thresholds and tipping point. So Kelly Abel from the United Nations University Institute is said in this context, going beyond just the biophysical threshold, what would be the best way to integrate, for example, these social capabilities as well in a habitability analysis beyond just acknowledging they exist. So, and she suggests that maybe David Rothald, you could explain a little bit your equation, or also other research opinion about this integration of the social capabilities and going beyond the biophysical threshold.
Well, I can try. I was really interested in David O'Byrne's suggestion in his talk. There are probably ways of squaring up different local perceptions of the important elements in a capabilities analysis. Like if we're trying to understand what it is that would orient someone around a perception of habitability, that these are going to vary quite a lot from place to place. And so I've tried to incorporate this in my concept. This will show up in my paper. But I really, I've got a little bit of background in in SEN's capabilities approach, and I think that this could be really promising. One of the notion that I've dealt with is that there's an intersubjectivity issue. The habitability of one person is related to the perception of habitability for one person is related to another person's perception, and that these vary across scales, right? Like there are people, there are power imbalances within a community where certain perceptions matter more than others, especially as we move into institutions. Decision makers, policymakers who control budgets, they would have a lot more influence and their perception of habitability than say a poor marginalized member of the community. And so I really do think we need to get a better sense of how to do this. I've got a proposal for how to integrate different perspectives, but maybe, I'm interested in hearing more from David on that.
David, do you want to add something?
Yes, I agree that there's maybe a lot that we could talk about, and I look forward to reading the paper. And there was a lot of parallels I saw between what you were saying and then also my own ideas. I think, and this is maybe getting a bit off topic, but I think what is very useful with SEN's idea of social choice is that it subjects subjective evaluation to social evaluation in a sense. So people can come with their individual priorities or their individual perceptions, and then they can put them forward as something that they prioritize in defining habitability or in bringing to public policy. But then it subjects that to public discussion. What do we all think about this? And it has the idea that there are some things, some prioritizations that other people make that we might not share, but we can accept as perfectly reasonable. So we can accept, if I'm a person with children and I prioritize education, I can accept that maybe an elderly person will prioritize healthcare. I don't share that as my number one priority, but we can see that as mutually reasonable. Whereas there are other more subjective evaluations that we might not share. So I think that mediation between subjective and kind of objective social evaluations of priorities or of perceptions of habitability, whatever it is we're talking about in a particular case, is really useful concept or contribution.
Yeah, thank you, David. I guess what could be an interesting point to add up here, if I think about what you present, Carol, is also the question of whom would so the idea is whom define habitability or unhabitability. Sorry. So when it means to put the concept in practice or to have a formal definition, or to measure that this subjectivity, this aspect of positionality could be quite tricky to consider.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I agree. And there's also the added complication that, your perception of habitability can change over time. And I think, so whatever you might capture in some sort of, public discussion or whatever is not necessarily going to be the same as what happens after the next disaster. So, there needs to be some sort of way of tracking changes in perceptions of habitability over time in whatever kind of definitional processes are attempted to be used.
Just moving on, I'm sorry, it's a little bit confusing because the questions in the chat, a question in the Q&A. Coming back to the Q&A parts, there's a question from Sarah Rosengartner. She said, I'm very interested in the role of translocality in habitability. How could we start to visualize which connections between places matter most and how? Maybe Harald, you have a first thought on this?
Yeah, sure. I think I would similar what David also said. This depends, I think, very much on where you look at what kind of place, what specific place, and also for whom. Because one thing for sure, there is a very different embedding of places and social ecological systems in markets, in vertical and horizontal production networks, for example, right? So the degree to which, let's say, geophysical metabolisms are in the foreground for shaping the changes in habitability or the stabilizing habitability of a place, like upper watershed, for example, right? Or downstream relations, or whether market relations are more important, or whether migration linkage is more important because there's almost no state intervention. I think that depends very much on the type of place and the political economic situation, on the embedding in I would say multi-scale systems that we have. How to do that? Yes, I mean that's a question. For me, this is, and I'm very much in line with what David said. Start from the place and from how people experience changes, and from that you can most easily, I think, navigate through the status of habitability and the influencing factors that are contributing probably most to the changes. First take.
Thank you, Harald. Yeah, coming back to the next point, maybe it was a point from Alex. I guess it's good to want to mention about learning more about the idea of social tipping points and whether in the work of Habitable, in the project of Habitable, some evidence has been found. If you want to say a few more, and Maya, you're welcome to answer.
No, this has been terrific, and thank you to all the panelists. So my question is partly born out of an awareness of, in some travel I did in China, where you have this concept of hollow villages, where villages kind of lose their economic dynamism as younger people move out, as the elderly are left behind. Some of this is state-driven, so there's an actual ecological migration program, as they call it in China, which moves people from rural, isolated, mountainous communities down into oasis communities. I visited one in Gansu province, both the place where people were moved from and the resettlement area. And there were some who stayed in the mountainous areas, among ruined houses and made their living and continued to do so. But this kind of concept of economic dynamism and social interactions and things that occur in healthier villages was largely missing. And I was just wondering, maybe Maria can speak to what thus far the Habitable Project is finding, because I know social tipping points is one of the topics that you are covering. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. Yes, so as part of Habitable, we are indeed expanding on the concept of social tipping points, specifically related to climate migration. So like the outcome that we are looking at is whether out-migration results as in response to climate variability, to changes in climate variability. The way we're doing this is we are conducting a longitudinal survey in 4 countries, in Ghana, Kenya, Mali, and Ethiopia. And we are aiming for testing whether we can find some discontinuities in out-migration rates that can actually signal some crossing some thresholds on climate migration. But yeah, I just wanted to add also that, or maybe my colleagues from Habitable can also add that this is a very large project, and we're also exploring more mechanisms in different ways. So maybe you could add, I don't know, Harald or Marion could add on this.
Maybe just looking at the time and the fact that we have quite some questions, we just to stress that we have also, so thanks a lot for all the questions that have been posted, and that during the week we will have, so through the don't know what's exactly the name of it, but so the way of sharing the message in the post, all the questions can be answered and can be debated and discussed through the week. So please just apologies if we do not have time to go through your questions, and don't hesitate to re-ask during the week. It's really the kickoff of the seminar. So. And then I guess it will also allow us to have a bit more food for thought and an explanation of what activities, for example, we have been doing in the context of Habitable. Alex, we're supposed to finish in a few minutes, right?
Yeah, so what I propose is I'll just share a few logistics for folks so that they can hopefully the slide now, and what I don't seem to be sharing the right slide, so let me shut that off. What's going on? Sorry, we'll do our best here, folks, but sometimes technology interferes. Well, I don't seem to be sharing it, but what I wanted to say was that the cyber seminar will start today. All the questions that we were unable to answer, as Marion said, we will answer during the cyber seminar. So please repost your questions. We will be posting one of the expert panelists' papers per day. So you will see those posted, and then on that day or any of the subsequent days, you're welcome to intervene and talk about what that panelist paper meant to you, or questions that you have for the panelists, or ways that you might contest some of these concepts. And I saw one question about carrying capacity. I think there's room for ample debate about the relative importance of biophysical limits, population growth, decline in land degradation and decline in habitability in different locations, as well as all the social components and the real importance to locally define these things and to address things like Amartya Sen's capability concept. So this is, I'm sure, going to be a really vibrant debate. You can sign up to join the cyber seminar by going to the bottom of the page. And if you're not already subscribed, you can find the instructions for doing that there. But with that, I want to thank all the panelists and thank Marion for doing an excellent job in moderating the discussion. And we look forward to our conversation over the coming week.